If you would, before we get started, please pray with me. Father, I pray for the people in this room. There are people here right now because you brought them here. Before the foundation of the world, you decreed that they should be in this room this morning because there is work you want to do in their hearts. There are people here right now that do not know you, people who've been searching for you in one way or another for their entire life, and you've brought them to this room this morning to bring an end to that search, to reveal yourself to them, to introduce yourself to them. And I pray that you will open their ears, open their eyes, open their hearts to the truth of who you are. And at the same time, there are people here this morning who maybe believe in you, but their hearts are hard and rigid. They've heard the stories about you, but they feel nothing. They have no joy in you, no love for you. And I pray that you will open their hearts and give them a saving faith in you. Give them a new birth in Christ. Transform their hearts and fill them with love for you, joy in you. Make them into your people. Turn them into your children. Work out a spiritual revolution in their hearts as we exalt your name by meditating on the story of the empty tomb and the risen Jesus. Adopt these people as your children and fill them with your Holy Spirit like you did on the day of Pentecost to stir up a spiritual revolution here in our community that is absolutely unlike anything we've ever seen before. Not through the power of my mediocre preaching, but through the power of your life-giving and life-transforming Spirit. As we learn about the beauty of Jesus on display in the Easter story, captivate us, raise up our dead hearts and our dry hearts, and glorify yourself here in our midst. And all of God's people said, Amen. Well, I'm so glad to see everyone here this morning. Thank you so much for joining us for our 2024 Easter celebration. It is always such a joy and a blessing to gather together as the people of God to celebrate the gloriously good news of the resurrection and everything that it means to us and for us. Every year we look at the Easter story from one of the four gospel accounts of Jesus' life in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this year, as you probably noticed, we're focusing on John. And I'm unbelievably excited for this morning because I think that John chapter 20 may be my favorite version of the Easter story, the story of the resurrection of Jesus. Anybody else just love John? John is your favorite. Is it just me? All right, there's a couple of us, but John's gospel may be my favorite account of the resurrection of Jesus, and the reason is unbelievably simple. It's because John's gospel is aimed directly at people like me. It's aimed at people who doubt. It's aimed at people who struggle with the faith. It's aimed at people who have a hard time believing. I want to invite everybody to be extremely honest real quick. Some of us are not used to being honest about ourselves at church, but I want to invite us all to be really, really honest for a moment. If I can get a quick show of hands, have any of you ever struggled with doubt? All right, we've got a room full of honest people. You've struggled with doubts about the faith, doubts about God, doubts about the Bible, doubts about religion in general. Maybe you've struggled with whether any of this is really true. Maybe once upon a time you were skeptical of the faith, skeptical of all religion. Maybe you still are. Maybe that's the reason you're here. Maybe once or twice a year you go check out a church service just to see if maybe this time it'll be different for you, right? Maybe this time it'll feel true, but whatever your relationship with doubt is, John's gospel was written for you. John says, these are written so that what? So that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John says, if you are a skeptic, I wrote this for you. If you are a doubter, I wrote this for you. He says, if you're on the edge, if you're not quite sure, if you're struggling to take the plunge, I wrote this gospel account for you. And he punctuates that by retelling the Easter story through the eyes of a guy we traditionally call Doubting Thomas. Ever heard of Doubting Thomas? Doubting Thomas is one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, and Thomas is a lot like you and me. He hears Mary Magdalene say that she's witnessed the risen Jesus, and he's skeptical. He hears the other disciples say that the risen Jesus appeared to them, and he's skeptical. He knows that when something sounds too good to be true, it is. And so he needs proof. He needs evidence. He needs to see for himself. In other words, if you're someone who's naturally a doubter, a skeptic, you're interested in Jesus, you want to know more, but you still struggle to believe all of this God stuff is really true, then Thomas is like you. The Gospel of John is for you. The story of Easter is for you. And this is all very personal to me because not that many years ago, I didn't believe any of this. Not that many years ago, I didn't believe any of this. Not really. Like, I was raised like every other kid in the Bible Belt. You know what I'm talking about? I was dragged to church every week from the time I was in diapers. I was waterboarded with Bible stories from a very early age. I had to do something called Bible drills. Anybody ever have to do those? I had the whole Bible Belt kid upbringing, and yet I could not relate to any of my Bible Belt kid friends because I was always skeptical. Like, it seemed like everybody around me just believed whatever their parents told them, right? Whatever their teachers told them, whatever their preacher told them, but that is just not the way that I am wired. Instead, I looked at the world around me. I looked at all the suffering, all the evil, all the tragedy, and I thought, if there's a God here, he's doing a terrible job. That's what I thought. I looked at the Bible. I saw how much of the Bible is strange stuff, right? All the weird laws, all the stories that seem violent, that seem bizarre. And I said, if this is the book God wrote, then I think there's something wrong with him. That's what I thought. I looked at all the religions in the world. There are roughly 10,000 known religions in the world, and I thought, it's so stupid to think that out of 10,000 religions out there in the world, there's only one that actually got it right. That seemed insane to me. And so I would talk to my parents about this stuff, and they wouldn't really have an answer. And I would talk to my friends about this stuff, and they would say, I don't know, man, my parents said it's true, so it must be true. And I would talk to the leaders at my church about these things, and they would always say some version of the same thing. You know what I'm about to say, right? They'd say, don't worry about it. Just have faith. Which is the wrong thing to say to somebody who is naturally skeptical and inquisitive, right? And so right about that time, middle of high school, I said, I think religion might be a bunch of BS. That's the censored version that I can say from the pulpit on an Easter Sunday. So I spent the large part of my younger years extremely skeptical about God, the Bible, and religion in general, especially Christianity, because like doubting Thomas, I needed more than just this is what my mom and dad believe, more than just this is what my culture believes, more than just this is what the authority figures in my life have told me to believe. I needed more than just don't worry about it, just have faith. I needed proof. I needed evidence. I needed to see the truth of Jesus for myself, or I was not gonna believe anything. Spoiler alert. I believe now. Because just a couple years after all of these things, after a really long process of working through my doubts and uncertainties with a friend of mine named Brad, I had a radical conversion experience, and I gave my life to Jesus, but it wasn't driven by fear, and it wasn't driven by my emotions, and it wasn't driven by pressure from my culture or my family or anything like that. No, what happened was that I actually started searching. Started searching for the truth. And when I actually started searching, what I found was that the Lord has left a breadcrumb trail that leads directly back to himself for anyone who takes an honest look at the evidence he's left behind for us. And there is no clearer evidence for the truth of Jesus than the Easter story. If you're a doubting Thomas type like me, and you can feel the call of Jesus, the pull of Jesus on your heart, but you're not quite there yet because you want proof, you want evidence, you want to see for yourself that there really is a God, and that Jesus really is that God, and that God really is worth giving your life to and staking your life on and spending your life worshiping and serving and following. God has given us the proof we've been looking for in the Easter story. Because in the Easter story, Jesus claims to be the God of the universe, and then he proves it by rising from the grave. I'm going to say this again. Jesus claims to be the God of the universe, and then he proves it by rising from the grave. You might remember this if you were here for our Why We Believe series about a year ago. But I'm going to say this one last time, but this time for anyone who is willing, I want to say this together. And so if you're willing, say this with me real quick. Jesus claims to be the God of the universe. And then he proves it by rising from the grave. And we're going to spend the rest of this morning breaking that glorious reality down together. Let's start at the beginning. Because before anything else, we need to talk about the fact that Jesus claimed to be the God of the universe. I've said this about 100 times already during the first 10 minutes of this sermon, but did you know that Jesus claimed to be the God of the universe? Not every group or religion or sect believes this, but this is very much what Jesus said about himself. Jesus didn't just claim to be a wise man. He didn't just claim to be a great prophet. He didn't just claim to be a great teacher. He didn't just claim to be an angel. No, Jesus claimed to be so much more than all of those things. He claimed to be the God of the universe. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Throughout his life, Jesus described himself in very specific ways. The words that he used for himself have very specific meanings. And what I'm about to say barely scratches the surface, but for one, Jesus consistently described himself as Lord, which is the Greek word Kyrios. And Kyrios is one of the Old Testament titles for what? God. He's saying, I am the same Kyrios, the same Lord, the same God that your forefathers spoke to in the Old Testament days. So Jesus takes God's title for himself. Here's another one. In John 8, Jesus takes God's personal name for himself. He says, before Abraham was, I am. That's a weirdly phrased sentence, right? But it's weirdly phrased for a specific reason. It's because he's quoting Exodus 3:14. That's the burning bush story. If you've ever seen the Charlton Heston movie, you might know what I'm talking about. But God gives himself a name for Moses to call him. He says, tell the Israelites, my name is Yahweh, or my name is I am. And Jesus is saying, I am the same Yahweh, the same I am, who met Abraham, who met Moses at the burning bush, who met all of your forefathers in the Old Testament. He's taking God's personal name as his own. Here's another one. In John 15, he says, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. And in John 10, he says, I and the Father are one. He's not saying that he is the Father, but he's saying, I am the same God you are speaking to when you're speaking to the Father. Here's another one. In John 19, he quotes Daniel chapter 7, which says that God himself is coming on the clouds in glory at the end of time. And Jesus says to the people who are about to crucify him, you will see what? You will see me coming on the clouds in glory at the end of time. He's saying, I am the same God that the prophet Daniel was talking about. He's claiming to be the God of the universe. That is the claim Jesus is making for himself. And it's natural to be skeptical of that, right? That's a really big claim to make, because a lot of people have claimed to be God throughout history, right? A lot of people have claimed to be God on earth throughout history. The crazy guy who lived behind the gas station in the town I grew up in claimed to be God on earth. But what every single person in history who's claimed to be God has in common is that 100% of them are just crazy. But Jesus is different, because unlike every other person who's ever claimed to be God, Jesus could actually prove it. He could back it up. He could validate his claim to Godhood Because Jesus proved that he was God by rising from the grave. Easter is the story of how Jesus proved that he was God by rising from the grave. So, what do I mean by that? Here's what I mean. We know from history, not just the Bible, we know from history that as many as 500 people claim to have seen the risen Jesus after his crucifixion. Did you know that? It wasn't just one random guy who said, hey, Jesus rose from the grave, take my word for it. It wasn't just the 11 remaining disciples saying, yeah, we saw Jesus risen from the grave, just take our word for it. You didn't have to take anybody's word for it. We know from history that as many as 500 people claimed to have seen the risen Jesus that first Easter morning and the 40 days that followed it. And they spent the rest of their lives testifying far and wide that Jesus was not dead, but had risen from the grave. Jesus proved that he was God by rising from the grave. And yet, once again, that just sort of sounds crazy, right? Because people don't rise from the dead, do they? That's not something that happens. Once in a blue moon, a medical team can resuscitate somebody who died for a minute or two, right? Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. There's a handful of stories, but that's not really the same thing, is it? No, dead people don't rise from the grave. It's not humanly possible. And because of the fact that dead people don't come back to life, a lot of people just reject the possibility that Jesus rose from the grave outright. You know what I'm talking about? A lot of people just refuse to even consider the possibility that Jesus rose from the dead. They refuse to even look at the evidence, and instead they try to come up with alternative explanations to try to explain away the empty tomb. You know what I'm talking about? Try to explain away the great cloud of witnesses who testify to seeing the risen Jesus. They try to jump to any other explanation besides the resurrection. Case in point, if you pick up an issue of Time magazine or National Geographic or something like that around this time of year, every single year, there's always what? There's always a picture of Jesus' face with a cover story that says something like, here's what really happened on the first Easter morning, right? Ever picked one of those and thumbed through it? Waiting in line at Carly C's or something like that? They're always like, we know Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, so what really happened that morning? Ever read one of those? The world is looking for alternative theories and alternative explanations to explain away the empty tomb. And I'm going to zero in on just a couple of the most common ones real quick. We're going to take them one at a time. Because the first theory that you hear a lot from people who deny the resurrection is called the swoon theory. Ever heard of this one before? The swoon theory says that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. It just seemed like it because he didn't actually die on the cross. Ever heard that one? Is that familiar? Swoon theory says that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He just passed out from exhaustion, from blood loss, from excruciating pain. Swoon theory says that when they took him down from the cross, he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. When they put him in the tomb, he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And then on the third day, what happened? Finally woke up. He regained consciousness. So he got back up. He walked out of the tomb, went and found his disciples, and they ignorantly assumed he must have risen from the dead. That's called swoon theory. And there's a lot of people out there who believe the swoon theory. Time magazine article at Walmart right now. Cover story is swoon theory, but there's a problem. And that is that the swoon theory only makes sense if you don't know anything about crucifixion. Because it was basically impossible to survive crucifixion. Here's why. Crucifixion began with something called scourging or flogging. Ever heard of scourging? They lash you with a special whip filled with large chunks of metal and sharp pieces of bone. It was designed to rip the skin and muscles off of your bones while you were being whipped. Crucifixion started with 39 lashes like that. Most people died during the flogging. They bled to death before they even got to the cross. But even if you survived the scourging, you wouldn't survive what came next. Because next up, they would make you carry the cross several miles up the hill in your weakened state. Then they would hammer thick 10-inch nails through both of your wrists, which would dislocate your wrists so you couldn't move your hands. Then they would hammer 10-inch nails through your ankles, which would dislocate your ankles so your feet were paralyzed. Then they would dislocate your shoulders so your arms were paralyzed, and they would put you upright on the cross so that the weight of your body would permanently force your lungs into an inhale position so you couldn't breathe, and your lungs would start to fill with fluid. And the only way to get a breath in was to use 100% of your remaining energy to lift up so that you could exhale, which got harder and harder as the hours passed by. Your breaths got shallower and shallower as the fluid rose higher in your lungs, all of which puts so much stress on your heart that you begin to go into cardiac arrest, they've discovered. In other words, when you are crucified, you are bleeding to death, drowning in midair, and succumbing to a heart attack all at the same time and in excruciating slow motion. It was basically impossible to survive this. And in the profoundly unlikely event that you did, you would be permanently paralyzed and irreversibly brain damaged for the rest of your life. And because all of this is true, when the Journal of the American Medical Association did an analysis on swoon theory, they determined in no uncertain terms that Jesus could not have survived his crucifixion. And so Time magazine is wrong. The swoon theory doesn't work because we know for a fact that Jesus could not have survived the cross. But that's just one theory. Let's talk about another one. Because the second theory that you hear from people who deny the resurrection is called the stolen body theory. Ever heard of this one before? The stolen body theory says that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. The story just spread around because his disciples stole his body and then falsely claimed that he was resurrected. Is that one familiar? The stolen body theory says that after Jesus was buried, his disciples snuck in during the night, stole his body, and then went all over the world falsely declaring that he'd risen from the dead. That's another really popular one. That's the cover story for National Geographic right now. But the stolen body theory doesn't work either. Here's why. Over the past century, archaeologists keep discovering more and more and more ancient Jewish burial tombs from the first century, the time of Jesus. And what they found is that those tombs were designed to be almost like an impenetrable fortress. They were designed to be practically impossible to open once you sealed them up. They were trying to make it impossible for grave robbers to get in and desecrate the body. Did you know that? And they did this in a really specific way. What they did was the tombs would be secured by two separate stones, two separate interlocking stones that were forced into place and then hammered until they were sealed airtight. The first stone was a massive, round-ish stone that it would take about 15 men to roll into place. It was like picking up an army tank, I think. I don't actually know what an army tank weighs. That just seems like a good image. But that first massive stone would be placed over the mouth of the tomb. But then they would specifically cut a smaller disc-shaped stone, and they would forcibly wedge it across the larger stone to seal it into place. And these two specially curated stones were made to be practically impossible to undo once they were set. And so firstly, the disciples couldn't have stolen his body because they couldn't even have opened the tomb. That's the first roadblock. But secondly, we know from history that the tomb of Jesus was protected 24/7 by a group called the Temple Guards. Ever heard of the Temple Guards before? These Temple Guards were an elite force. The Temple Guards were the best trained group of soldiers in the region. Historians actually argue that if the Jewish people had raised up an entire army with the same training as the Temple Guards, they might have been able to topple the Roman government. They were the best men available, and they did not accept failure. To the point that if a Temple Guard failed to catch an intruder, he was executed for negligence. To the point that a Temple Guard who fell asleep on the job would be punished as a traitor, and they would be executed along with their entire family for their failure. That was the Temple Guards. You brought in the Temple Guards when you had a job you couldn't afford to screw up, because it was practically impossible to get anything past them. That's who the Sanhedrin placed in charge of guarding Jesus' tomb. They were trying to make sure that none of his disciples could steal his body in the astronomically unlikely chance that they could get into the tomb. And that means that in order to steal the body of Jesus, the disciples would have had to have first gotten past the elite, top-of-the-line killing machines who were stationed in front of it. And then if they managed somehow to pull that off by some great miracle, they would have had to have somehow broken through the impenetrable fortress of a tomb that was purposefully designed to be impossible to reopen. In other words, it was an impossible mission. Not even Tom Cruise could have pulled it off. And so National Geographic is wrong. The stolen body theory doesn't work, because we know for a fact that the disciples couldn't have stolen his body. But on top of all of this, there is another reason why the alternative theories that deny the resurrection don't hold up. And it's actually the most obvious. It's so obvious that it's easy to miss. And that is that if these 500 witnesses to the risen Jesus were lying about what they'd seen, why would they be willing to suffer and die for the sake of their testimony? You know what I'm talking about? Every single one of these 500 witnesses to the risen Jesus endured decades of brutal torture because they testified to the resurrection. But not one of those witnesses ever recanted their claims. Let me explain what I just said. In the generation following the death and resurrection of Jesus, we have around 500 people who all claim to have witnessed the risen Jesus. But the Roman government wanted to snuff out the Christian religion as quickly as possible. They wanted to put an end to the Christian religion as quickly as possible. It was a control thing. So, during the first century, what did they do? The Roman government tracked down every living witness to the risen Jesus. Everyone who claimed to have witnessed the risen Jesus, they tracked them down and they arrested them and they beat them to a bloody pulp and they started mercilessly torturing them to try to get them to recant their testimony about having witnessed the risen Jesus. But not one of those witnesses ever recanted their claims. You're starting to see where we're going with this. Some of what I'm about to say is very disturbing, but this is very important. Because if you were one of those original 500 witnesses, here's what would have happened to you. What would have happened is that one day the Roman government would show up at your house or your place of business or your church or your family land, and they would seize you and they would take you away. And they would tell you to recant your testimony about the risen Jesus. And if you said no, they would start to torture you. If you need to, you can cover your ears for about the next 90 seconds, because I'm going to describe what they would do to you. Because first they would start with beatings. They would beat you until your entire body was covered in bruises and your bruises start to burst open. Then they would move on to whippings. They would whip you until your skin was hanging off your body. And then they would rub salt in your open wounds. Then they would start cutting off body parts. First, they would start cutting off some of your fingers. Then they would start cutting off toes. Then maybe one of your ears. Then they would start cutting off whole limbs. They would start gouging out eyes. And then they would start to really turn up the heat. That was the pregame. I'm literally quoting from ancient historical documents here. I'm not trying to be edgy or gross, but what would happen is that they would bring in carnivorous animals and they would have them start to eat you alive from the bottom up. Then they would bring in a giant vat of boiling oil. I don't even know where you get a giant vat of boiling oil, but they had one, and they'd bring it in, and they would submerge you in it mid-boil for as long as they could without killing you, and then pull you out at the last minute. And then do it again. And then pull you out at the last minute. And then do it again. And then pull you out at the last minute. Again, and again, and again. And here's why this matters. It's because all throughout this process, between every new round of torture, just as it became unbearable, they would stop for a second and say, all of this can end if you will just say, I was lying. All of this can end if you will just say, I never saw the risen Jesus. If you recant your testimony, we'll nurse you back to health, take you back home, and never bother you again. They would torture you and then give you a chance to recant, and then torture you again, and then give you a chance to recant, and then torture you again, and then give you a chance to recant again and again and again until you cracked or died. Not one of those 500 witnesses ever recanted. Now listen, if you were lying about having witnessed the risen Jesus, don't you think you would have cracked at some point during all this? Would you have boldly sat there while the Roman government beat you to an inhuman pulp, brutally ripped whole pieces from your body, and slowly fed you to animals while you were still conscious in order to maintain something you knew was a lie? What would be the point? What would be the benefit? What do you gain by enduring torture and death for something you knowingly made up? No. These men and women who witnessed the risen Jesus endured the most horrific things imaginable because they knew they were telling the truth. They were testifying to the truth of what they'd really seen and heard. And that's why historians have increasingly come to the conclusion that those witnesses could not have been lying. Even historians who don't believe that Jesus is God, who don't believe that he rose from the grave, who don't believe what they said, they've still come to the conclusion that those guys definitely thought they encountered the risen Jesus. And when you take all of this together, a very clear pattern starts to emerge. Here's the pattern. 2,000 years ago, a horde of men and women claimed to have witnessed the risen Jesus back from the grave. He could not have survived the cross. They could not have successfully have stolen his body, and they could not have been lying, because it isn't possible that every single one of them could have maintained their testimony under the relentless torture of the Roman government if they were knowingly lying. And because of the overwhelming weight of the historical evidence, there is only really one reasonable conclusion we can come to. And that is that Jesus really rose from the dead. I love the way the High Court judge, Sir Edward Clark, put it. He said, the evidence is conclusive. And over again in the High Court, I've secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling. As a lawyer, I accept the gospel evidence unreservedly as the testimony of truthful men to facts they were able to substantiate. And that means that Easter is for doubting Thomas types like you and me. Easter is for people who can't do the blind faith thing. Easter is for people who need proof, who need evidence, who need to see for themselves. Easter is for people who need to put our fingers in his wounds and who need to put our hands in his side, because God has given us the proof we've been looking for in the Easter story. Because in the Easter story, Jesus claimed to be God and then proved it by rising from the grave. And so when Thomas saw the wounds in Jesus' hands and his side, he cried out to Jesus and called him what? Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Listen, the Easter story means that Jesus is the God you've been looking for. Jesus is the God that your heart has been crying out for. Jesus is the God you spent your life either searching for or running from. But it's time to stop searching and it's time to stop running, because he's here. Jesus is the God of the universe, and that is gloriously good news, because he is gloriously good. He's not a distant God. He's not a cruel God. He's not a weak God. He's the God who went to the cross for us. He's the God whose love for us is so deep and so wide and so vast that even when our sin rightly condemned us, he took our condemnation on himself. He came down from heaven and took his righteous wrath against sin on his own shoulders, and he satisfied it. The God of the universe gave himself in your place so that you could be rescued and redeemed and forgiven. And now he's calling you to come and receive that forgiveness. Come and receive that redemption. Come and receive that rescue. He says you don't have to be a wanderer anymore. You don't have to be a prodigal anymore. You don't have to be drowning in spiritual darkness anymore. No, he's come to give you life. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Listen to that. Is anybody in here weary? The God of the universe has a message for you. He says, let me give you rest from your weariness. Is there anybody here burdened? The God of the universe has a message for you. He says, let me give you rest from your burdens. Are you exhausted from your own brokenness? The God of the universe says, let me give you rest from your brokenness. Are you sick of running away from him? The God of the universe says, let me give you rest from your running. And so right this moment, whether you realize it or not, you're in the same position that Peter was in back in Matthew chapter 4. It says, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Listen to that. The God who rose from the grave is calling you to follow him. He's standing on the shore, and you are in the boat, and he says, come, follow me. He says, follow me out of condemnation, out of your weariness, out of your brokenness, out of your darkness, out of your apathy, out of your fear, and come follow me into genuine joy, genuine worship. He says, come taste and see that the Lord is good, because I have knocked down every wall that stood between us and broken every chain that holds you captive to your old life and adopted you into my family and my kingdom and my covenant. Whatever your relationship with God, church, the Bible, religion has been in the past, this is the call that Jesus is holding out to you right now. This is the welcome Jesus is offering to you right now. This is the hand that Jesus is reaching out to you right now. So take it. Come, follow Jesus. And I want to talk all about what that means, what that'll look like, and what your next steps are if you want to come follow Jesus with us this morning. And so what we're going to do is we are going to sing one last song to worship the Lord together. We're going to close out the service with some announcements and stuff like that. And then I am going to be in the room just behind these doors to my left and my right. If you want to know more about the God we meet in Jesus Christ, what it means to follow him and how to know him as your Lord and Savior and King, come meet me after the service. And we can talk and pray through everything that's on your heart. Let's pray. Lord, Easter reminds us who you are. You revealed yourself to us in the first Easter morning. You made yourself unmistakably known to us on the original Easter morning in the empty tomb. You told us who you were, and then you proved it to us by rising from the grave. And now, because you have gone to the cross and risen from the grave, we can be gloriously redeemed. We can be saved. We can be reconciled to you. We have nothing to fear in death, in hell, in condemnation, in wrath, because of what you did on the cross and because you rose from the grave. And that is gloriously good news. And when we think about the way that you have made a way for us to be saved through the cross and the empty tomb, we cannot help but fall down on our faces and worship you. So now be glorified in our grateful worship this morning. And all of God's people said, amen. If you would now stand as we respond in worship through song together.